Welcome to today's episode. Today's episode, we're going to be talking more about integrations, and mainly we're going to be talking about different ways in which we can pass authentication, get authorized with the system, and execute whatever requests we want to execute. So until today, you were probably aware of our existing authentication scheme that is either a cookie authentication with the help of BPM CSRF cookie, and then the other one is the use of unauthenticated service. Now, those approaches are great, but they offer some challenges. So for example, if we want to authenticate ourselves with the username and password and get that BPM CSRF token, what we need to make sure of is that our password doesn't change as the time goes by. So for example, if you have an SSO or if you have some sort of an Active Directory integration, we may run into instances where system administrators require us to change our passwords. As our passwords change, our integrations should also change, and that's obviously a problem. So what we're going to look at today is how we can get a token that doesn't, well, I don't want to say doesn't expire, it expires, but it expires in a slightly different way. So we're going to take a look at what's called an identity service. An identity service is an additional product that installed on top of Creatio. It works with Creatio, works with the database, and it allows us to pass authentication in the auth credentials flow. So let's take a look how we can configure it. What you're looking at here is just a fresh install of Creatio. There has been no configuration made to it, and my application currently lives on my local machine on port 7040. I'm using Postgres database, but it doesn't matter which one. You can use any one of them. And my database is deployed in Docker. So is my Redis. Let's take a look now at how we can configure our identity service. Before we do anything, let's head out to academiccreatio.com and some help. If we search this, you'll see at least at the time of the recording, article provided setup automation is the one that will for us just install some additional packages before we move on with the installation. One is to download and install this bundle. Now this bundle, if we open it here, you'll see that it's a .NET Hosting 318, and I've already downloaded that in the past. So just make sure that you download and execute this file. This is what allows us to host a .NET Core application in IIS. Now, if you don't want to use it IIS, if you want just to use Kestrel, then you don't need to install it. But if you want to use IIS, then you need to install this bundle. After having installed or after having downloaded and installed this bundle, you need to make sure that you restart your IIS. If you're in doubt if you're installed it correctly or not, just restart your machine. That will definitely take care of it. Now, the other thing that we also need to make sure of is that we have proper version of .NET Core installed. The package that we're going to be using, Identity Service, requires .NET Core 2.2. So make sure that that thing is also installed. You can always use .NET Core list versions command to simply list all the versions or list SDKs that you have installed in your machine. The easiest way is to just simply go and install it beforehand. Now, unfortunately, it's not in the documentation here. It doesn't tell us that we need to install 2.2, but from personal experience, I can tell you that 2.2 is required. Okay, so let's move on with the installation. What is this identity service? Where I can find it? Where do I get the installation files? This article is pretty good. It gives us most of the details, if not all, but I'll show you kind of a quickest way to get that stuff done. So let's head out to the installation directory, and in my case, it's inside a netpub, dev-root, and here's the Studio IS example. That stands for Studio Identity Service Example. This is where my application lives, and this is what I was showing you on the screen earlier. Now, inside this folder, you will see an identity service zip archive. So all I'm going to do is I'm just simply going to open it up. So I'm going to use 7-zip, and I'm going to extract to identity service directory. It takes no time at all. This folder is fairly small. Now, inside this identity service, everything that we need. Here is everything that we that we need here. So this is a prepared application, and you can already run it just by using .NET command, and you can just start running this application. Before we run it though, like there are a couple of things that I would like to change here, and those things are configuration settings that will allow our main application, or that will allow this application to connect to the main application database, so that we know how to create these tokens and how to pass this authorization. And so let's take a look at the structure here. There are a couple of important files. First is going to be this app settings, and the other one is going to be towards the bottom, called web config. Now the things that we will configure inside web config is essentially whether or not we want logging. Now I suggest that we use logging, and the only thing that we need to let me close this. And the only thing that we need to configure here is essentially this property, stdout log enabled. By default, it's false. I'm going to change it to true. This will allow the application to log out whatever errors we might be having and make sure that we have a better time debugging. Okay, so this is done. We can now close this web config. And now it's time for us to move on to the app settings itself. So app settings, where's my netpub? Root, example, identity service. And in here, I want to make sure I go inside my app settings. Here's my app settings file. Now, what I will see in this app settings file is quite a lot of configurations. Now, all these configurations, not all of them may be used, but I will walk you through the most important ones. What you will see here is that we've got some debugging level to begin with. Now, when you're doing it for the first time, I suggest that you change it to debug level. And that simply means that everything is going to be logged out to a log file. And the log file, I believe I have an example of it open in my environment. It will look something like this. We'll see plenty of examples of what the system is doing. We'll see all the requests that are happening, and it's going to make it easier for us to understand if there are any errors, especially if you're doing it for the first time. Now, this file contains a couple of other important properties. For example, we need to make sure that we connect this stuff. Now, by default, when you're getting identity service, it thinks that it's going to run in MongoDB. Now, we're not going to be using MongoDB. We're going to be using, in my case, Postgre database. Now, the Postgre database or MS SQL connection needs to be provided. So if you want to use MS SQL, if your main application runs well, then you need to simply take this part of the word MS SQL. That's if you run on MS. If you're running it on Postgre, then we take just this string. Now, this tells the system, or this tells the identity service, which connection string to use. Now, obviously, once we told the identity service which connection to use, we need to actually configure our connection. Now, the question is, where and how do I get this connection from? Well, this connection string can be used from the same connection string that we have provided for the main application. So let's open this file in iOS, in identity service example, and I'm just going to go into my connection string folder. In here, I have configured, obviously, my connection string. So what I can do here is I can just simply grab this line for my connection string, all the way with double quotes. And I can come back here and I can override whatever's here to whatever's in my main connection string. Perfect. At this, I'm almost done. Now, there are a couple of other things that we may want to override. For example, allowed registered domains. So this is going to be a list of hosts from where your application can register. So in my case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply list an instance of my application. So I'm going to say that I'm going to be using something like this. Oops. Okay. Krylov. And then the app lives in 7040. And I'm going to also list here, just to be on the safe side, 7041. This is where we're going to install identity service itself. And if you want, you can do something like localhost 7030. And then the same thing for 7041, just to be on the safe side. Okay, so we've provided some configurations here to make sure that we can connect to the application from a particular place. And the next thing that we want to go about is to configure this thing. Now, this thing allows us to specify the scopes that we're going to be granting to whatever the application is. We're going to be allowing certain redirects, certain URLs, the grant types, etc., etc. Now, the Academy documentation provides a great example of what this may look like. So let's head out again to the Academy and search for identity service one more time. I'm not sure why I closed it. And in here, in the article, you will see that here is the example of this client ID. So that's essentially the line that we need to configure. Now, what you're not seeing here is that we are saying generate client ID, generate name, generate secret. So those are the values that you're expected to provide on your own. We don't want to know what those passwords are, so we're just giving you a generic link. There are recommendations in terms of the length of the secret, in terms of the length of the client ID and the name, and I've already configured that for myself, so I'm just simply going to copy and paste it. In my app settings, here is what I'm using, and I will share this file if you want to. And I will just simply replace this client ID here. Perfect. So now what I essentially configured is I said that my client ID is going to be called Creatio Designer. My client name is also going to be called Creatio Designer. And here's my super secret password that I will not tell anyone. Now, the super secret password will not be visible or seen by anyone, and this is simply for the backend configuration parts to talk to one another. So if you're worried about protecting your password or keeping it in the clear, this is just sitting in the back of the server, and if you persist the security over physical presence on the site, and if no one can access your file system, then it's pretty safe. The rest of the configurations here just do not touch for now. Unfortunately, they have to be a part of the configuration as the identity service looks for them. But as far as you're concerned, you don't really need to remove them. So if you just remove something, you may break things. Okay, good. So now we've configured our identity service and we've configured our configuration here. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that this thing actually runs. So I'm going to grab a terminal, clear. And inside my terminal, I'm going to go inside, where am I? I'm not in the right place. So let's say CD, what folders do I have? I forgot. So CD, Studio, as example, and CD, Identity Service. Perfect. So here's the list of all the files here. And this is essentially my PowerShell. So the way you can start, or the way you can configure or test, is by simply saying this, .net identity service.dll. If you run this command, then you will see that the identity service will try to start. And if you have any errors here, what you will see is that some stuff or some errors are going to be visible to you here. You can scroll through this log and you will see that some errors might come if, let's say, I couldn't parse your JSON or if something else happened. But essentially, it's telling me now that it's running on host 5000. Now that's good. I don't need to do anything else here. This was just to check that the identity service starts, but I really don't want to host it this way. I want to make sure that I run it with the help of my IIS. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into my IIS and I'm going to create a new application here and a new site. We can start off by creating a site. Now, here's my Studio IIS example, and what I'm intending doing is I'm going to take the same name for my website, okay, and I'm going to create a new one. So let's go and click Add Website. We're going to give it the same name, and here I'm going to prefix it with IS, which stands for Identity Service. Now, the path to my website is going to be where the application resides. So let's find in that pub, root, example, Identity Service. Perfect. Now, the only thing that I need to specify is, let's say, the host name that it's going to respond to. So I'm going to say this. And I think that because my main application lives on port 7040, I'm going to put my identity service on 7041. Now, as soon as I'm doing this, my identity service wants to create this pool. Now, this is okay, and we can change the configuration, but perhaps it's better if I first go and create my pool. So let me create my pool first. Add an application pool, and I'm going to give it the same name, IS. Okay. Now, in here, the important thing is to make sure that it's not a CLR, but that you choose no managed code. Now, this is how the .NET Core applications are launched with the help of that bundle that I have previously shown you that you need to download. And so as soon as you create this, okay, a new pool is created for us. Now, let's go back into our site. Let's go back and add our site one more time. So we're going to call it IS, and we're going to give it path to the folder where our files are. Root, example, and let's find identity service. Perfect. Let's say that we're going to live on 7041, and the host is going to be this. Perfect. So now I have my application configured. Now I have my IIS configured. Now it's time for me to go and configure something inside of Creatio. Let me shut that down. Let me close that down. And let's go to our application. Let's go to 7040. Okay, so this is my main application. I'm going to log in, and now I have to make a few changes here. Now, the changes that I'm looking to make are going to be configuration of my system settings. So let's go on this coggy and let's look for system settings. And inside my system settings, I'm going to be looking for auth. So here's my auth 2.0. And in here, you will see that you've got a couple of configurations already available to you, or a couple of settings that you need to configure. So the first one is the authorization server URL. So that's going to be HTTP in my case, and it's going to live on port 7041. Done. That's all I need to configure here. Let me save this. The next thing that I want to make sure of is that I configure my client IDs and my secret. So let's go into client ID setting, and you might be wondering where I'm getting my client ID. Well, let's go back to our Visual Studio where we have configured our app settings. So we're going to go in Identity Service, and we're going to look at App Settings. And from App Settings, let's make sure that we grab the client ID. So this part is going to be my client ID. So we're going to come and paste it here. Now, this is not a secure text, so this is just a regular text of 50 characters long. So you will always see this. So let's save this. The next one is I need to configure my client secret. Now, my client secret is encrypted string, so you as the user on the front end, you will not see what the value of this thing is. Now, if you're just testing something, okay, so just grab the value of your secret, and if you're testing, make sure that you paste it here. This is the one that matters. But for myself, I also paste it here just to make sure that I'm pasting the right thing. Let's save this. Okay, so we have configured our settings, and I'll save this. We've configured our settings, and we're almost ready to move on and configure our default client. Now, in order for us to do that, what the article is telling us is that we need to come here, and under installed application, I should see this auth 2.0, but I don't. So the question is why? Well, the reason is why is because we have not yet executed this SQL command. So what I need to do is I need to execute this SQL command against my database on my machine. So let me go into my database management tool. That's going to be this fella. And I'm going to find the database that I want to execute against. And in our case, it's going to be the studio example. And let me go and get the SQL tool. How do we do that? Tools, query tool. Okay. And from Creatio documentation, I'm just going to copy this text completely, and I'm going to paste it in here. Okay, so once I execute this script, and you could tell that it executed successfully, which is perfect, I no longer need my database. And the only thing that I need to do now is I need to just simply exit my application and reconnect back. So let's go back and let's log in. Okay, so far so good. Everything seemed to be working fine. Let's go back to our identity service here, and let's take a look what we're seeing here inside our identity service. In here, we're not seeing any loggings just yet. So what I want to make sure of is that I do have something showing up here, but it's not going to show up until we actually start making requests. And the first time we make a request is when we try to create a default kind of a root connection between the identity service and Creatio application. So in order for us to do that, we need to go back into our system settings here. And under installed applications, you now see this new option called auth integration option, right? So auth to all integrated applications. If we come here, it looks that nothing is here, and that's because we have not created the default client that will allow identity service to communicate with Creatio. In order for us to do that and it's very important that we do that, is we click on action, and in here we say create default resource. Okay, so we've created, or we're trying to create default resources, and it's telling us that we're unable to connect to auth server at a particular port. Let's go and investigate why we cannot connect. So let's go back into our application. What we will see is that we now have logs here. If we read our logs, we will probably somewhere towards the end, we will see the reason that we cannot connect to it. So let's just open it one more time. Application started, hosting, and what are we seeing here? We're seeing some errors. Let's see, application exception. Okay, so we've got some issues with certificate. Now, this is one thing that the article is not telling us about. So let's go ahead into configuration of our file here in app settings. And what the system is complaining is that it was unable to parse, okay, this certificate. Now, in order for us to mitigate this error, we need to specify a full path. Now, where is this OpenSSL PFX? Well, it's going to sit here inside identity service. And if we look for this file, there is the file. So all I have to do is I have to just simply come here and find this and do something like this. Now, inside the JSON, we need to escape everything with double slashes. So a single slash is a double slash. Okay, so let's just make sure that we do it just like that. Save it, and let's go ahead and try to execute it one more time. Actions, create default resource. Still unable. Let's go and take a look at what the logs are. So studio example, identity, logs, and we're still, it's the same error. So why are we unable to do so? Well, let's come back to our IIS and let's make sure that we just restart our application pool. Where's my studio example? So I'll stop it and got to give it some time before you launch it back. If you launch too soon, IIS gives us an error here. Oh, you know what? Before I do that, I may have forgotten to do one more thing. No. We changed the database. So here everything is fine. Ports are fine. I think we've configured everything. Yeah. So let's give it a one more start. So we have to wait until the IIS runs. All right, so it's taking a lot longer than I hoped it would. Still nothing. Eventually it will. Now, the other way for you to achieve a similar result here would be to use that .NET command. So we can use that .NET identity service from inside the folder to just simply start it to make sure that everything runs. And here in my example, okay, finally it started. So let's go ahead and try installing it, or let's try running this command one more time. Create a default. Okay, and let's take a look at what my logs are. So I'll see that here are my logs. And now my logs are slightly longer. So let's see if it worked. Now the default resource was created. Okay, so that's a good thing for me. And what that means is that if I go all the way down, you'll see a very long list of things. Okay, and then towards the bottom, you'll see some token validation success, essentially response. Here's my Creatio designer, and this information is strictly for you for internal use if you want to debug something. But once the default resource is created, unfortunately there is nothing here that would tell you whether or not the resource is created. So you kind of have to know that you've created it. And what you can do now is you can create a new endpoint. So let's say this is going to be my test application, and the application URL. Normally, this would be a URL where you can get some help, so you can do something that represents your application. So let's do something like this, creatio.com, https:// can't even spell my company name. Okay, so we can provide some description in terms of what this application is all about. These URLs are irrelevant at this point. They're not going to be doing anything as we're simply going for credentials grant. So we're just going to be getting an access token. There's going to be no back and forth like you would expect in the regular auth authentication where it has to do with the client. In this case, this is just server to server. Now, when we're creating our resource here, what we need to make sure of is that we specify the user on whose behalf all queries will be executed, or essentially on whose behalf a user connection will be created so that you can execute database requests. So in here, let's take a look what we have. I have a supervisor, I have some system portal. You can have other users on whose behalf you're creating it. I'm just going to simply take supervisor at this point. When I click save, I end up with my test application. I have my client ID and my client secret. Now, these credentials are going to be used in the next step where we're going to try to pass authentication and to make sure that we can authenticate our requests against this endpoint. Okay, so let's now test. Let's now talk a little bit about our configuration. So how can we do it? I'm going to use my Postman, and I will provide copy of the environment and copy of the request for you so you can download and simply import it into your Postman. But essentially, what I have for us is a little collection here, okay? So we've got two authentication methods. So the first authentication method is the one that you're mostly familiar with, and that's going to go to our endpoint service model auth service login. Okay, we're going to pass. So inside the body, in the JSON format, we're going to pass username and the user password. And when we do so, we're going to get a response. And as soon as my response is 0, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to cookies, right? I'm going to go back here in cookies. I'm going to take a look at BPM CSRF cookie. I'm going to grab value, and I'm going to copy this value for all my next requests. Essentially, this workflow is defined here inside my tests. And inside the test, I'm showing you how you can get these cookies in the Postman. And we're just saying Postman get response cookie, grab BPM CSRF cookie, grab its value, set it to the environment BPM CSRF. Now you might be wondering where the environment is configured. And in this case, the environment is configured right here. If we're going to take a look at my environment, I have created a couple of variables for myself. And we have something called base URL. Base URL refers to the URL of my website. So let's change it to 40. And the base URL _is is for my identity service. So that's on 41. This is something that you are expected to change for yourself. So let me change it here as well. and let me change it here as well. Okay, and let me save this. So now I've got 7040 and 7041. This specifies the URLs that I'm going to be calling to authenticate myself. Now I also have provided username and user password, and I've used the standard supervisor, and this is not auth flow. And then I've got client ID and a client secret, and these two values are going to be dynamically populated for us. Okay, so you can ignore these values when you import it. They will not work for you, but this is because I'm running it in Postman, so I already have some values assigned to these variables. Okay, so let's run this URL one more time. So as soon as you run this URL against this endpoint, you'll see that your code is 0. That means that you are successfully authenticated. All we need to do now is we need to go to cookies. Okay, we need to grab the BPM CSRF cookie value. And then for all my following requests, and I'm going to demonstrate how to use DataService with the cookie authentication. In my following request, what I want to do is I want to make sure that I include the BPM CSRF key with the value of the cookie that I just grabbed. And so when I send this request, I'm going to get some results back. If I don't provide BPM CSRF value, then I'm going to get forbidden, unauthorized request. So let's make sure that we do so. And inside the body, I've prepared the shortest possible request to get a list of all contacts ID. Okay, so here's your contact. This is all you need to do to get some data out of DataService. And we're using a select query, and we're querying all contacts in my system. All right. So this is our basic authentication. I'm sure you're familiar with that. This is how we've been authorizing and authenticating ourselves for a very long time. Now let's take a look how we can do authentication with the help of token. For this, I've prepared another request. Now, this request is slightly different. The first of all is that it's going to be addressing the URL of the identity service. So it's no longer going to 7040 to the main application, but it's going to address the identity service URL, and hence the port 7040. Now the URL itself /token /connect/token, and what we need to pass here is a couple of things. First, we need to make sure that we're using basic authentication. So if you're doing it in code, there's a ton of libraries in C#, in Python. If you need examples, just let me know. But there is a ton of libraries how to do basic authentication. For basic authentication, we need to make sure that we provide a client ID and the username and the password. And the way you can do it here is, unfortunately, only with the help of, you can't really put a variable here. The only thing that you can do here is you can actually, no, maybe you can, client secret. So let's put client secret like this. Okay, so where do I get a client ID and a client secret? Well, these two values I'm going to get straight from what we just created. Why am I logged out? Do I have multiple instances? Maybe. Let's go and log in one more time. Not sure why I logged out. And let's go back to System Designer. Let's go back to our auth test application. And here's my client ID. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply copy this. This is system generated value. You can change it. Okay, and let's go back to our Creatio. Okay, let's edit this. So what I want to do is I want to make sure I edit my client ID just like that. So here's my new client ID and client secret the same way. I'm going to copy my secret and I'm going to paste it right in here. Now, you have some token ID, but I will explain what that stuff is. So let me save this. And now let's try to send this authentication. Now, before we do that though, inside my body, what I need to make sure is that I am providing this grant type for client credentials. Okay, so just make sure that your body in the form of form data, so it's not a JSON, it's a form data. And if you don't provide it, what you're going to get is an error, so invalid request. When you're providing the proper request, so with the grant type client credentials, and you send it, in response, you should get access token. Now, this access token can now be used, this is a JWT format, and this access token can now be used to authenticate or authorize all your following requests. So I'm doing the similar thing that I did here for the regular authentication in this request. Just like we did it here in the test, we grabbed the value of BPM CSRF cookie, What I'm doing in here, and you will get it in your, if you import this environment, in my test, all I'm saying is that I would like to get a response, okay? And I'm grabbing the JSON of the response, and this is just how you write these tests in Postman. And then I'm setting the environment variable, access token, to response.accessToken. This is going to be an object, thus there is a property called access token. There's also a property called expired in, and a property called token type. The only thing that I care about is this particular value. This is what I'm going to have to be adding to all my following requests. Now, if we're going to take a look at what's inside my variable right now, you'll see that this access token has been changed to reflect whatever the values I've received here. That means that I can now use this variable to send authorization request or send the real request to Creatio with this thing. Let's go back to our token. Let's execute the same thing. Now, in this example, I'm showing you how you can use not just a regular contact, but how you can request a couple of columns. Again, very simple request. Now, let's take a look at my headers. Inside my header, all I have to do is I have to make sure that I am providing authorization bearer, and I'm providing the value of access token that I received a second ago. If I'm sending it, then I'm getting my result back. If I'm not providing any authorization, obviously I am forbidden, so I'm not allowed to authorize. And there we have it. So now the question might be, okay, what's with this token? How long it lives? What can I do with this? And how do I renew this token? Well, it turns out that this access token, you can generate as many tokens as you want, and all these tokens will live for 3,600 seconds or 1 hour. So this token will be good for 1 hour, and after 1 hour you're just going to get unauthorized requests. So if you're getting an authorized request, just simply call this URL one more time, get a new version of the token, and off you go with the request. I'll leave it up to you to decide how you're going to be managing it inside your application, but it's safe to generate as many tokens as you want, and they will only live just like any other JWT token for only a short period of time. In this case, it's only going to live for 1 hour. Now, to show you an example that this token does exist, or that this token does work, even the old one, what I did here is, let me go ahead and delete everything here, and we're going to go back inside this auth. Oops, we're going to go inside this auth authentication token, and I'm going to grab the value of this token. Okay, so I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it right into here. Okay, and as I do so, I am still getting my responses. Now let's go and authenticate ourselves and get a new token. Now, you're not going to see, due to nature of JWT and the way it works, you're not going to see a change in the top part. So before the dot, you're only going to change, you're going to see a change here in the second and the third part. So right now, my token is PUBW. So if I send this request one more time, you can tell that my request is totally different. If I'm going to go in my data service and I'm passing this new token, so everything works fine, but also the old token, the one that, that we got not too long ago, there we go. So it still works. So all these tokens that you generate, they will hang around for quite some time. And then the identity service will say, you know what, you've expired. You no longer valid. So it's going to give you an error, and then it's going to be up to you to make sure to go and get the new token. Now, this authorization tokens, they will work for requests such as DataService. They will work for your Odata request. They will work for your configuration service. So it will work for the regular configuration web services, for essentially everything that you're doing whenever you're authorizing yourself. So the identity service should be sufficient for you. Okay, so the advantages. Let's talk about the advantages and when it's a good time for you to use this, when it's not a good time for you to use this. Obviously, when you're creating your environment, we can just simply deactivate this token, and then that's it. We're essentially disconnecting an external application without changing any username and passwords. Now, when we're doing username and password thing, imagine that you have a configuration and you're authenticating yourself against Active Directory, and now you have to share this username and password with external applications. That's probably not a good thing, as now your password is stored elsewhere, And most importantly, if you change your password, which you probably will, your application integrations will break. Now, this allows us not to break any integrations. We're essentially creating this application endpoint, the client ID and the secret ID. We create this, think of it as credentials for per application, and we can control application level access rather than a user level access. We can also specify what user to use for when we're creating or when we're minting that user connection. So if you want to give fewer permissions to a user, by all means, go ahead and choose someone else here, and then you can control the scopes that, not the scopes, but you can control the access to data with the help of selecting this user. Now you can have as many applications here as you want, and as you integrate, obviously, you'll have more and more of them. Now, how do you do it in the cloud? In the cloud, you obviously cannot go and install your own applications, but you can run you can run your identity service elsewhere, but how do you know how to connect to database? So no one's going to be opening holes for you in the cloud. So what you will need to do is you will need to contact support, and they will tell you what the URL is for your particular instance of the application. So when you're in production, just reach out to support, and they will allow you to use identity service. So it's all pre-configured. If you're on site, then you're obviously expected to do it on its own. Now in the database, there are a couple of tables related to identity service. We're not going to go into details, but there are tables. They start with the word identity, and there's a table clients, and you can review the properties stored in those tables if you're interested in what and how these tokens are generated and where they're stored. But essentially, this is how we would be able to now pass authentication with any third-party application. Just simply give them a token, and they would renew it, or they would get a new access token, and they can talk to the system. Now, the third way of addressing your application is creating unauthenticated service. Now, as the name suggests, there's no security there. There's no permission model there. It's essentially you're providing a handler for a web service call. It's a security threat, as you're allowing someone to, without any authentication, to communicate with Creatio. So it's highly discouraged. However, that might be something that you may want to use for your maybe webhooks where foreign applications don't know how to pass authentication. There was an article on the Academy, on the Creatio, academy.creatio.com, how to build unauthenticated services. We're not going to go into details. It's fairly straightforward, just a few configuration changes and you're done. But this auth integration provides a very secure way and a fast way and a very flexible way to authenticate yourself. So please do use it. If you have any questions, I will post the configuration files, and I will post the Postman collection and the environment on GitHub for this episode. So you'll see it in the description below. Maybe within a couple of hours, I will get to it and we will post it. And if you do have any questions, please do raise an issue on GitHub, and I'll try, me or my colleagues will try to answer it and address it. All right, so this is it for today. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you.